to you, but one has to just see that the tax which we are really imposing, who actually is bearing the burden of a particular tax or set of taxes. For example, if we have the greater focus on presumptive tax regime, then that presumptive tax regime will result in more indirect taxes or passing on of that as a cost, and as such, the burden will not be on those who were supposed to be taxed, the burden will be passed on to the others or the consumers on that basis. Now, generally I've seen studies done, now I'm referring to a study done for 45 out of these 152 economies, and out of that, what is the tax structure, how do they work? They're normally the corporate and income taxes basically are the two main ones which are there, and generally it's been seen that they have a negative effect on economic activity. On the other hand, taxes on imports and exports also have a significant negative effect on investment. Now the distortion which comes in becomes worst when in an economy the tax evasion is prevalent and informal sector is large. And believe me, 90% of the developing economies have the same problem, have the similar situation. There are large tax evasion and a large informal sector which exists in most of those economies. The developing countries have a tax structure dominated by indirect taxes with a limited number of capital and wealth taxes. In a number of countries, generally wage earners and certain major corporates pay taxes. And there is a widespread informality and non-compliance. That results, and is being taken as part of the survey, the results and responses from the people, that taxes in this situation become a tax on honesty. Those who are honest, they are paying the taxes. So this is a tax on honesty rather than tax on income or tax on the basis of indirect basis if the tax was indirect tax. Now, generally, the broad-based tax system with fewer deductions and exemptions, relatively low tax rates, and compatible with administrative capabilities of a state are expected to provide stable, reasonable, efficient, and more pro-poor alternative of financing the public expenditure. And in the economies for which the survey was done, the VAT was one, which is very widely being used. Low level of import duties for protective purposes only. The simplified personal income and corporate profit taxes, land and property taxes, and recent studies on the tax reforms, if you look at in some developing economies in the Southeast Asia. Again, if you look at that result, I have seen that the conclusions were there were enormous difficulty with implementation of the tax reform. We have seen that, we have gone through that process. There exists incentive for governments to continue to add taxes rather than rationalize in cases of resource shortage. Administrative complexities of tax collection, vested interest group and lobbies, and difficulties in balancing equity and resource generation consideration. These are the factors which are prevalent in most of those economies and are similar to what we see in our own country. Fiscal infrastructure. Now, naturally, these are the things which you see here are commonly used, that it should be a fair, it should be equitable, the tax situation system should be efficient, it should be effective and sufficient, simple and convenient. These are the general things which are there. But in terms of overall resource situation, most of the countries are suffering from more or less a similar issues. Those countries which have gone through the IMF plans or programs, basically, as Pakistan has gone through, have been, most substantial number of them or majority of them have had situation where they could not achieve the desired results of those plans, and the reform process could take place for a couple of years, but it started reversing, and the results were not which the governments wanted. The governments wanted the results to actually come up with the resources so that they can handle the social side of the thing, spend more money on education, spend more money on health, spend more money for the poverty alleviation. Those results were not achieved. Now, the other resources which could arise are the foreign financial resources. And they are basically either international banking system or international capital market. These are two things which are there, other than the government ODAs and others. ODA from bilateral donors, that is official development assistance. This is substantially large, which is there for a number of countries. And I'll talk about ODA a little more later. Loan from multinational financial institutions like World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and Asian Development Fund. The factors which are there, which are affecting the external inflows in most of those economies, you relate it to Pakistan, but I'm talking of most of those economies. The economic security is one factor which is very, very vital and important. And then the political and economic environment variables, including the government leadership, risk of external conflict, corruption, rule of law, racial and ethnic conflict, political terrorism, civil war in a number of countries, quality of bureaucracy, risk of repudiation of contracts because it's a situation of legal system in that sense, basically, risk of expropriation by governments, political rights and civil liberties. These are the various factors which are there. And the other factor, which are economic factors in the rest of the world, that is the country of origin, are also relevant. Because if the fund is coming from a different country, then a number of factors of that particular country are relevant, which are relative growth prospects, interest rates, tax regimes. And then there are a lot of non-economic factors, political will, administration efficiency, culture of tax compliance, openness of economy, money supply, party level, distributional equity, and HDI. All these are the factors which are relevant factors for consideration of mobilizing resources from external sources. ODAs basically, they're just based on the potential and strategic interest. They look at the relative level of development. There's a donor country allocation for aids. Robustness of national effort to mobilize resources is important, how robust you are. Adverse development in prices of exports, sharp fluctuation of exchange rates, and instability in the international financial system. But in all these things, their impact is very, very relevant because there is an uncertainty element with all these donations or the ODA contributions, because there may be a commitment, but that commitment may not translate it into a corresponding disbursement. For example, all commitments made by the Friends of Pakistan, actually hardly anything materialized. And such, if you start taking the estimates in the budget estimates, and then you don't recognize which happened in the last budget, if you look at that, we were expecting a lot more disbursement from foreign resources, and it didn't take place. And that's why it's volatile, is unpredictable, and it has to be taken care of. The last one is the public debt, which is another source which is there. It contributes to growth and poverty reduction. It may help in that particular, but if it is intelligently used, it is kept within a sustainable limit, and if it is in that, and its use is for development purposes, its use is not for consumption, its use is not for current account expenditure, then the public debt could become a very important source. We are facing in Pakistan a problem in terms of the public debt situation of unsustainability and a very high debt servicing component which exists. Now, there was another study which was carried out to evaluate the growth effect of public expenditure at the aggregate and disaggregate level. And there were 30 developing countries which were picked up, and a study was done by the Manchester School. And the countries are listed. I won't take the names. That included Pakistan, by the way, as well. And the following conclusions were reached: that a government expenditure on education has long-lasting effect on economic prosperity. The rationale is consistent with both new growth literature and new classical growth models. Aggregate current expenditure has no effect on growth.